All right, Pouring Nation, now that you can't stop paint pouring, your paintings are starting to add up in your living space or your studio, and you need to figure out how to properly store them. Now, I do not want you to make the mistakes I made and ruin paintings like this and like this. So here's the tips I recommend you follow to keep your masterpieces safe. My first tip is the most obvious, but it needs to be said. Hanging your paintings, especially in places where there's not a lot of foot traffic, is the best way to protect your paintings. Some paintings I just lean up against the wall so they don't have anything touching them. And some, like these canvas panels, I can put on a dish strainer so they are not touching each other at all. Now in my house you'll find paintings all over the place so that I don't have to stack them and risk them being damaged. So my next tip is to keep your paintings in a place that doesn't get extreme temperatures and that has lower humidity. The reason why we want to do that is because acrylic paint is essentially plastic when it dries. And what happens to plastic when it gets cold? It gets brittle. And what happens to plastic when it gets hot? It gets malleable and can be dented and moved. So you want to make sure your paintings are in a place where they're not going to get brittle and they're not going to get malleable and also sticky. So I just want to show you an example of what happens when you get paintings too hot and too cold. Now I have these paintings that I was going to paint over. That's my trash bin down there of paintings. And they were on top of each other with a bunch of other paintings on them. And if you'll notice, this painting is actually dented because it does get warm in here in the summer, which it's July now. And there's a little bit of paint that got stuck. So essentially what happens is I put the paintings on top of each other and then a couple more paintings were on top. And this painting stuck to my other painting and ripped off some of the paint. And it also dented that whole painting. There you can see the frame. And you can see the dent that it made because this got too hot in my studio and then it had weight on top of it. So as you can see, I can push. It's not just the canvas that is malleable, but the paint that's dried on top, the plastic is dried on top, is also malleable. So we want to keep our paintings from pointed edges or additional weight, and also from paint that isn't cured or varnished so it doesn't come off on our paintings. Now on the opposite spectrum, I have this painting that was that I love, that's above my window in my studio, and I think it was 2 winters ago I went to grab it because I was going to dust up here and it was cold and I grabbed a little too forcefully and I stuck my finger right through the paint. Now this was made of glue, and glue is not as strong when it's dry as, for example, Liquitex pouring medium, and it essentially just shattered. My house is pretty warm, but that's an exterior wall, so it was cold, and this room was cold because I had the door shut and it only has one air return, so I put my finger right through it, and that actually cracked both sides and totally ruined this painting. Now I love it, I'm not going to sell it, so I leave it up here in my office anyways, but that is one of the things that I've done to my paintings because I stored it incorrectly and I didn't handle it with care when it was cold. So the next tip is don't stack your paintings very high on top of each other horizontally. Now I have 16 by 20s here and I only have about seven of them. But what happens when you stack these, they semi-stick together. Now we're going to talk about how to keep that from happening even when you stack. But the more weight you put on them, the more likely you are to get them to stick together, especially if it gets too hot where they're being stacked. So I only stack these because I can't stand them straight up in this. And I only stack them about 7 high and then I'll have to make a new stack. What I prefer to do is stack them horizontally because you don't get very much pressure in between the paintings on each other. And then I can store a lot of them together. And these are my heavy tiles that I put on the end to kind of hold everything together. So as you can see, I can store a lot more paintings this way. And when I store my paintings, whether they're on top horizontally or vertically, I always do back to back and front to front. So back to back, front to front. That way, the fronts, hopefully if you've taken care of them correctly, and again we have a tip about that, they're not going to stick together, and the backs, you don't care as much, at least these type of paintings. If I put backer on my paintings, I had backer going to backer also. So back to back, front to front is the key, and horizontally instead of, or vertically instead of horizontally. If you do horizontal, don't do very high because you don't want a lot of weight, especially on these bottom ones. Now, before I get to the final tip, if you're a new acrylic pour artist or an artist that is having trouble with your acrylic pouring, this is the channel for you, as I come weekly with different videos on how to improve your acrylic paint pouring and how to troubleshoot any problems that you have. Now, my last and most important tip is varnish your paintings. You saw me lift these up, and they're not sticking to each other because these are all varnished and completely dry. Now, I have a set of paintings here where I was testing acrylic pouring mediums, and each one of these is a different medium, and I have never varnished these, and they've been sitting on top of each other like this for a couple of months. So what happens if you don't varnish is this. These are all stuck together. And you can actually see right there where some of the paint stuck. So those were really stuck together. And that's definitely not what we want to have with our acrylic pouring. So varnish is actually made to be a barrier. One, it helps to fill in any pinholes you might have. Two, it gives you UV protection. Three, it gives you dust protection and a protective layer over your painting. But as you can see here, I actually had some orange from a different painting come off because these were stacked and not varnished. Now, I don't want you to do that and ruin any of your paintings, so definitely varnish your paintings, which is the most important tip, to properly varnish your paintings before storing them. Now, if you're having trouble varnishing your paintings or getting varnishes that don't have any brush marks and are nice and smooth like my example board here, this is the video you need to watch next.